Norfolk is one of the worst places in the country for children getting excluded from primary school. A simple question tonight: why is it so high and what can be done to turn it around? Good evening. Norfolk has some of the worst figures for primary school children being excluded. Tonight on This Week we're asking why that could be and what could be done to improve things. I'll introduce the panel in just a moment, but first let's take a look at the figures.
The Department for Education figures say the number of primary school age pupils expelled in Norfolk rose from 39 in 2014-15 to 60 in 2015-16. That figure puts Norfolk as the third highest in the whole country. But when you look at the number compared to the total number of children in primary education in the county, that's 0.09%. That's the joint worst in the country alongside Salford. Just to compare us to some neighbouring counties, in Suffolk, 17 were expelled last year, and just 3 in Cambridgeshire.
Neil Perry reporting there. Well, joining us on the panel this evening is Des Reynolds, who's the Chief Executive of the Engage Trust, which runs the short stay school for Norfolk. Also here, Clare Jones, who's the head of Bignold Primary in Norwich, and Sarah Brownsword from the UEA, who trains graduates to become primary school teachers. Let's talk about those figures first of all. I mean, Des Reynolds, were you surprised by those numbers?
Sadly not, no. Since obviously I work in the sector and see those children day in and day out. So the numbers of children coming into my schools have grown and grown over the last few years. So
and
unfortunately,
they come to you
those aren't a surprise.
When they're excluded, that's when they come to you,
yeah, we run 9 schools across Norfolk, and we cater primarily for young people that have been excluded from school, but also those who've been unable to get a school place because of their challenging behaviour, and we also support young people who are medically unfit for school as well.
Okay, Clare Jones, were you surprised when you heard the numbers?
Yes, I am surprised, and I'm looking forward to discussing why that is so and why it is so much higher than our neighbours.
And what's the experience in your school? Do you exclude children often?
I don't permanently exclude children. I have done some fixed term exclusions.
But you've never excluded someone permanently?
I've never permanently excluded a child, no.
Okay. Sarah, what's been your experience were you surprised initially by when you looked at those numbers?
Yeah, I was quite surprised. I think it's especially surprising when you're comparing it to our neighbouring counties, so when you're comparing it to what's happening in Suffolk or in Cambridgeshire, which aren't that different in terms of schools, and yet those figures are very different.
What can we say about why it's happening then, Des? What's your impression?
Well, from my perspective, it's very much a perfect storm of a series of different factors. I don't think anything as complicated as this lends itself well to one simple explanation. But if you look, I tend to think of 3 really big factors. I think if you look at national factors, if you look at the way that the government over the last 7 or 8 years has massively changed their educational system, we have a system now that's much more focused on academic results. It's much more focused on a accountability culture that really is only really asking schools to look at a very narrow curriculum and a narrow range of measures of what a good school is. If you labour that on top of what have been a very long period of sustained funding cuts for schools and reductions in services that are available to schools, and then you look at sort of having gone through an economically very difficult period as a nation, statistically that has always been a time when exclusions have grown. So you end up in a situation really where you've got increasingly complex young people, and particularly some of the youngest are increasingly more complex. So you've got increasingly complex more people going into schools where there is no longer the time, there is no longer the money, there's no longer necessarily the incentive either to support and unpick those complex issues.
Let's ask Clare Jones. I mean, is that do you see those problems in your school or in the schools that you work with and that you know about?
As Des said, it'd be very easy to come out with a trite answer as to why those figures are so high and why young people are being permanently excluded. For every young person that we have in our schools, they come with a backstory, and some are more complex than others, and for every one of those children you have to put in place a package around them that means you can support them and support them to be in mainstream school. And it's a very quick answer, is to permanently exclude, to actually give the time to change that behaviour, and to change that behaviour in a sustained way, rather than any quick wins. That takes a lot of time. And if you're within a situation where maybe those services that you've relied on in the past have had their own cuts, if you think about the public services in a whole, the NHS, mental health services for young people, mental health services for their parents, all of those sorts of things, as well as children's services and everything else, when they're cut, to try and get those teams around those children with all their needs gets harder and harder.
Okay, let's ask Sarah Brownsword. I mean, when you're sending trainee teachers into school, presumably on placements, what kind of problems are they coming up against?
The two main things that the students ask us about all of the time when they start the course is behaviour management and how do they teach children that have got special needs. But unfortunately, there isn't an answer that we can give them, because each child is individual and you have to look at the children on an individual basis. So it is, we do put lots of things in place to train teachers in what we do at the university, but also by allowing them to observe experienced teachers and observing good practice in schools. But it is really hard to give those trainee teachers an answer, because there isn't necessarily an answer. It is really down to the individual children.
Okay, and what kind of, obviously we can't talk about anything that would identify any families, but what kind of problems do you see in your school? What, for instance, would lead a child to be excluded? What kind of thing would they have to do? Is that too hard to answer?
Well, I think it's really interesting, because I've been head of some very different sorts of schools. And what can be seen as extreme behaviour in one school can be seen as part of the course in another. And that's one of the things I would say about our teacher training, is that where possible, students need to have experience in different schools. So that they can get a more sort of average about what is poor behaviour. It'll also depend on the size of the class, and it will depend on how good the teacher is and how experienced the teacher is with children with challenging needs. And you will have all sorts of challenges, stemming from whatever's happened to them.
Yes.
So no child is born naughty. No child is born naughty.
Yeah.
No child is born bad. Right? Something has happened in their development that means they find behaving conventionally within a classroom situation difficult.
Okay.
We're blessed to have clinical psychologists as part of my team, and one of our clinical psychologists always talks about the fact that our students are extremely well adapted, because they are adapted, their behaviours are adapted to the experiences that they've had. So in their experience, they need to be loud, they need to be heard, they need to be able to act in those ways in order to get the attention or to get the needs met that they have. So it's really important whenever you see a young person behaving in ways which are, which you would think of as difficult or challenging or hard to like. Actually, what you need to always think is that what that child is doing is communicating with you. That child is talking to you in their own way, and perhaps the only way they can, to help you to try and understand what they need.
Okay.
And if you go from that basis, then it's an entirely different way to look at how you run your school.
Okay. Well, the County Council has a duty to educate excluded children. No one from the council was available to join us this evening, but they did give us a statement. They said the figures are now a year old, and although the rate of permanently excluded pupils currently remains too high, we know our overall numbers have started to come down since then. We want to offer the best possible education to young people in Norfolk, and we're working hard with schools to find ways to bring the number of permanent exclusions down. This includes increasing the number of places in alternative provision and supporting children to have the chance of a fresh start at a different school. So that's what the County Council is saying. Des Reynolds, is that your experience that the numbers are coming down?
I think it's right and proper that the local authority is very optimistic about the future, and I would really enjoy joining them in that optimism. I think at the moment I don't necessarily experience a reduction in permanent exclusions myself.
Have you got a big waiting list?
There is still a waiting list for our provision, unfortunately, and we're likely to start in September with a waiting list for that provision. That waiting list is a lot smaller than it was. And we are actively working with the local authority to identify premises so that we can open more provision and get rid of the waiting list.
How long was it at its worst?
The nature of the waiting list is that it will grow through the year. So in the last academic year, our school was full from the end of September through to the end of June. And that, obviously the number on the waiting list grew and grew through the year. That there are published figures to show that it was well over 100 from before Easter. So the waiting list, unfortunately, ended up with a large number of children being not in a registered school provision, which is, frankly, a tragedy.
Are some schools excluding too easily then? Is that what we're seeing?
Well, I think what interestingly, what Sarah was saying earlier was she was describing what I think of being as the outcome, or the unintended outcome of a government policy that encourages schools to feel very independent, encourages a system in education where everybody is their own fiefdom, and has removed a lot of the sort of oversight that certainly local authorities used to have. So you do end up in a situation where the standard of behaviour that warrants an exclusion is massively different from school to school. I'm in the odd position of seeing all of the excluded paperwork come across my desk for all of the children that are excluded. So it's very easy for me to see the massive range of what constitutes a really serious offence in one school, and what might lead to a child simply getting a fixed term exclusion or sometimes just a detention in another school.
Okay, we need to take a break in a minute, but I just want to ask Claire, do you sometimes come under pressure from other parents to exclude children? Is that a problem?
There is definitely. I've experienced this year a quite extreme example of parents' parental pressure to permanently exclude a child in my school, and I think that social media is not helping that.
And how did you deal with it in the end? If you can tell me.
Probably can't tell you, but it was dealt with in the end, but it was a very, very unpleasant time. For everybody involved.
All right, thank you all very much. Stay with us after the break. We'll be talking more about primary school children getting excluded in Norfolk and what can be done to bring the numbers down. Welcome back. This evening we're looking at why the number of primary school children in Norfolk getting excluded is so high. There were 60 exclusions last year, up from 39 the year before, although the County Council says the number will be down this year. On the panel this evening, Des Reynolds from the Engage Trust, which runs the short stay school for Norfolk. Also with us, head at Bignold Primary in Norwich, Clare Jones, and Sarah Brownsword, who trains primary school teachers at the UEA. So we've talked about some of the problems. What could some of the solutions be? What would you like to see first of all happen, Des?
Well, I think from my perspective, as a society, as a community, we have to be really clear what we want our schools to do. You can't have your cake and eat it. Ultimately, we cannot say to head teachers that we want you just to concentrate on English and maths, just to concentrate on academic results, and at the same time say, well, actually, you've got to do that with even less money, and you can't exclude any children. You can't have it always. If we want our schools to be more inclusive, if we want them to take the time and effort to unpick the behaviour for really challenging young people, to put support packages in place, then actually we have to stand up and say that. Whether we say that through the ballot box, whether we say that through the way that we talk to our community, whether we say that actually by how we respond to Ofsted results, however we do it, it's actually a responsibility for all of those of us that live in this community.
Let's ask Claire Jones. Is there too much pressure on schools at the moment, and is that something that could be dealt with to make it easier?
There's a range of pressures on schools, and I understand that the government and the DfE want high results, because we want to give the children the best education they can get. But where there is priority around what they get in their tests, there are going to be children in every class, in almost every school, that are not going to fit that narrowness of being able to achieve that test. So where do we sit as schools of saying we support inclusion, we want to be inclusive, we want to make sure we can support every single child to do their very best at the school, but at the same time looking potentially maybe at the other 29 children in the class whose learning is being affected by that one child. It's a very, very difficult situation to be in, and I'm interested to see how the Academy's agenda changes over the next few years, to see whether some of that pressure is going to be relieved.
And what's your experience, Sarah? I mean, you train a lot of teachers, but we also know that a lot of teachers are leaving the profession. So pressure on you, I suppose.
Yeah, it is, and that's one of the things that that has been really difficult. Obviously, we're still getting people who want to train as teachers. We're training them, but within 3 years, a lot of people are leaving, and it is down to that same pressure that Des and Clare were just talking about. Of trying to get those academic results at the same time as trying to be inclusive and make sure that everybody remains in the school. And it's leading to teachers suffering with mental health issues themselves, and that's when they end up leaving the profession. So it's really difficult to kind of keep teachers in teaching at the moment because of those pressures.
Yeah. What about parents' role? I mean, it's sometimes people just blame the parents, say, well, they've been brought up badly, it's all their fault. What role should parents or can parents play in helping in this area?
Well, I think, again, unfortunately, it's a real temptation to reach for, the big stick to batter the parents of the children and say, oh, that child's not being properly looked after, or, the parents need to do something about this. But actually, even some of our, best parents, in inverted commas, some of our parents that are hardest working are not able to, on their own, deal with all of the challenging, complex issues around a young person. They need support from professionals. And they need the support of a good inclusive school with them. You can't just say, oh, your parent needs to take him home and deal with him. That's not going to resolve those issues. It's a much more complicated situation than that.
What could we be doing with parents? I mean, should we be talking about parenting classes as compulsory? Is there anything as a teacher you can do to work with parents and help them?
One of my favourite jokes is how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb's really got to want to change. and I feel a bit the same about parents, is that you can suggest, we put on parenting classes, we try to get them engaged in what they're doing, but you can't force parents to do that. What I think you can do is make it really clear about how the school can support the child. I think the school can do their very best to involve the professionals that the school can involve, and then signpost the parents, the other professionals, mostly health, that would also be able to, to give their support. So you can have that team around the child, because that's what it does have to be about. And I know we joked earlier about teamwork, but for those particular children, it's not just about them, it's not just about school, it's not just about health, it's not just about parents, it's everybody saying, what are the needs of this child? Why are they behaving, the way we want them to behave, so challenging? What has happened? What can we put in place? And that's what we need to be doing.
Okay, well, we've been out on the streets of Norwich to get your thoughts on this. Is primary school age pupil too young to be excluded?
They know what they're doing, they know what good and bad behaviour is. I don't know if there's been something that a kid has been expelled for, but I think 11 can be expelled, should be expelled if they've been naughty.
My daughter is almost 10 now, and seeing her and her friends together, the way that they act, I mean, I can't see any reason for them to be expelled from school.
All depends on what they've done, to be quite honest. I believe, yes, it would be too young to expel a child of 11 years old.
Kids under 11 need a little more guidance, a little more involvement in their lives and direction, rather than just being expelled and kicked out.
I don't think a child actually knows what it's doing until it's a little bit more grown up, depending on the guidance and the teaching guidance, and depending on the situation.
Under 11 is far too young, under 16 is far too young. Expulsion is a failure of the teaching profession. Never happened in my day. Part of the problem, I think, is because we are now too PC, there's no discipline allowed.
Okay, so range of views there. We're too PC, there's no discipline allowed, is that fair?
No, I think, actually the reality is at the moment that both this government and the last government have massively increased the authority of head teachers and of schools generally to impose any sanction they wish. The reality is now that there is, once the head teacher has decided to permanently exclude a child and their governors have supported that, there's no power in the country that can overrule it.
But are children more naughty now than they used to be, or is that just a misconception?
I wouldn't think of them as being naughty. I would think of them as having additional needs and complex needs that affect how they behave, and I don't think that has necessarily changed. I think the one area where you can say that is for the very youngest. I think there is something really interesting happening with our very young children that are coming through, where there is a greater complexity of need than there was in the past.
Mm-hmm. I mean, has it changed in the sense that, in the past perhaps kids would be kicked out of school and not allowed back in at all, anywhere else?
There's certainly, quite rightly, there's much more rigour now about how to about exclusion. There was a time when if they were naughty in the morning, you'd send them home at lunchtime, and and they wouldn't come back in the afternoon. You can't say that now. If they're not there in the afternoon, then it's a fixed term exclusion and it has to be recorded. I certainly, the person on there saying it didn't happen in my day. I mean, I can remember children at my schools being expelled, as it was called then. So it's not about being PC, but it is now about making sure that if you're going to make that decision, because it is a huge decision to make, that you have done everything in your power up to that point to make sure that doesn't happen.
Are young teachers prepared for all this when they go into the job? It sounds overwhelming.
We try and prepare them, but I think I would agree with what you were just saying then, that exclusion needs to be an absolute last resort, and the schools need to be making sure that they are doing everything that they could possibly do before they go down that route. Because when you look at the statistics, you're far more likely to be excluded if you've got additional needs or special educational needs than any other children. And those are not children that are just being naughty. Those are children who have special educational needs and who legally schools need to make adjustments for. And that just doesn't mean adjustments in terms of what you're doing in the classroom. That means reasonable adjustments to policies and practices. So where you might exclude a child for a certain behaviour, if a child has special needs, you may not, you may make a different decision because of the specific needs of that child. Okay, well, as always, you've been getting in touch on social media. Tris says this is a shameful headline, a sign of the times that schools are no longer focusing on the child and more on their Ofsted status and SATs results. And you talked about pressures a moment ago. Carl says, look at the parents. He says, leaving the kids to their own devices while they're down the pub. I think a little bit flippant in that response, but again, we mentioned some of the pressure on parents then. And Jennifer Jane says, children do not come into this world wanting to be excluded from school or hit their classmates. Where do they learn this? And you mentioned that actually, that ultimately we're looking at a product of what has happened to them. So where are the solutions? What could we be doing to help these children?
Well, I think what we're really lacking in at the moment is leadership in this area. We're lacking in someone standing up and saying, this should not be happening, this is not the right thing to do. I think we need a lot more clear messages, both from local government and from national government, that says this is not what we want our schools to do. And I don't, when's the last time that you heard the Education Minister talk about inclusion? I'm old enough to remember when schools were inspected on their ability to keep young people healthy and making positive contributions, and we used to have something called Every Child Matters, where we talked about children in the widest sense of their progress. We used to have a department for education, and as well as children's and families and schools. We now just talk about education, we just talk about results, and until we change that, you end up with this unintended consequence of children falling out.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, but that is all we've got time for this evening. As ever, you can follow us on Twitter to see what's coming up on future shows and have your say at Mustard This Week. And you can watch all of our debates on our YouTube channel, Norfolk Now. Good night.